All right, so get ready, because we're diving into a case that I think will have you kind of questioning everything you thought you knew about family, truth, and what happens in those really high-pressure police interrogations. This one's about a teenager, Nicholas Lindsay, down in Florida, accused of killing a police officer back in 2011.
Yeah, and you know what makes this case even more interesting is that we're not just reading some dry old police report. We're actually going to be able to witness the interrogation as it actually unfolded thanks to a YouTube video.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a channel called Red Tree Stories uploaded it.
Wow, so we get to be like flies on the wall in this intense situation. Incredible.
Okay.
So let's jump right in. The video, it starts with Nicholas in the interrogation room, right?
Sure.
And his parents are right there with him. He's clearly shaken up, denying that he had anything to do with it. In fact, he says he wasn't even there.
Right, but you can tell even from the beginning there's like this tension in the room. The parents are definitely comforting him, yeah, but there's this feeling like under the surface that they suspect he's not being totally honest.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And, to add to that, the police, they already have some evidence against Nicholas, right? Like they found his shoes at the crime scene.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even some video footage that seems to place him nearby the night it all happened.
Yeah.
So you can really see the parents struggling, trying to support their son, but also kind of facing this mountain of evidence.
It's like, how do you even begin to navigate that as a parent? Right. You want to protect your child, but you also need them to understand, like, the real seriousness of what's happening, the legal side of it.
Especially when a police officer's life has been taken. We should probably mention, for context, Officer David Crawford, he was actually responding to a 911 call about a suspicious person when he was shot. So that's the backdrop for this whole interrogation. Heavy stuff.
Absolutely. And as the interrogation goes on, you can really feel the tension ratchet up. The parents, they become more and more urgent, pleading with Nicholas to just tell the truth. They start talking about what could happen, how serious the charges are.
But then they start using a tactic that's a little, I don't know, ethically questionable maybe. They start implying that if Nicholas confesses, he might get a lighter sentence. Like they're playing on his desire to just get out of there, go home.
Yeah, that's where things get really legally murky, especially because, well, Nicholas doesn't have a lawyer with him at all. And I mean, imagine being a teenager in that situation, scared, confused, and your parents, the people you're supposed to be able to trust most in the world, they're actually the ones pushing you to confess. Like, does that even count as a real confession?
Right. That's a good point. And I'm sure it's making a lot of our listeners think too, right? Like if you were in that situation, would you as a parent have done things differently? It's a tough call, no doubt.
Totally. It really makes you think about what you would do. Trying to protect your kid, but also making sure they understand what they're doing could have real consequences.
And in the middle of all this pressure, Nicholas, he finally breaks down, right? He whispers a confession to his parents. But here's the thing. He doesn't confess to being the shooter. He claims it was actually someone else, a guy named James. And he describes like this whole scenario of a car theft that went wrong. Everything just spiraled out of control.
And you know what's interesting? It seems like the parents' focus totally shifts at that point. It's less about, getting to the actual truth and more about protecting Nicholas no matter what. They start pushing him to tell the detectives the same story he just told them, even telling him to be a man and take responsibility.
So Nicholas ends up confessing to the detectives, right?
Okay.
And he sticks with the story he told his parents about the car theft and what happened with Officer Crawford. But, well, this is where things take another turn.
So as we dig into, like, the details of Nicholas's confession, right, the story gets, I don't know, even creepier maybe. Like, he describes this whole night, how everything just spun out of control. So he tells the detectives he got picked up by this guy, James. They were driving around planning to steal some cars. And he claims he was in the passenger seat when they saw Officer Crawford's patrol car.
Wow. So you can like totally picture it, right?
Yeah.
The adrenaline, the fear.
Totally. And according to Nicholas, they were parked by this triple a lot, I think, getting ready to steal a white Neon. He says that when Officer Crawford drove by, they jumped out of their stolen car and tried to run.
It's like, what would you even do in that situation?
Right. It's like fight or flight. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And according to Nicholas, as they're trying to escape, Officer Crawford yells at them to stop, to take their hands out of their jacket.
Oh, man. So he must feel trapped, especially because, we find out he actually had a gun on him. That just makes everything even more complicated, right?
Mm-hmm, totally. And this is where his confession takes like a super dark turn. He says that when he pulled the gun out, he thought the safety was on, but it wasn't. And he says it just went off, like by accident.
Oh, wow.
And then he claims he just panicked and kept firing.
Man, that's intense. He actually says to the detectives, I had to do it because I didn't want to die.
Yeah.
Like, that gives you a little window into what must have been going through his head.
Yeah.
Pure terror, just doing anything to survive. Probably not thinking straight at all.
I mean, that's what happens in these high-stress situations, right? Our brains just kind of short-circuit. We think we know how we'd react, but you never really know.
So true. And as Nicholas keeps talking, we start to see these, like, inconsistencies in his story. For example, he first tells the detectives that he was wearing a black jacket that night, but then, later, he admits it was actually gray.
Mm.
So you have to wonder, right, are these, like, slip-ups or signs that he's making it all up?
It's hard to say for sure. And remember, the detectives have already found some things that don't match up with what he's saying. They talked to a witness who saw the whole thing go down. And they have that video footage of Nicholas in the area. Plus, one of his shoes was at the crime scene. So even though he's trying to shift the blame, the evidence against him is definitely adding up.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit to the trial. Nicholas's lawyer, they argue that his confession was coerced, right? They point to how much pressure his parents put on him, the fact that he didn't have a lawyer there, and that the questions from the police were, like, leading him on.
So basically, they're saying that Nicholas, remember he's just a kid, felt pressured into confessing to something he didn't do. Like he was scared and just wanted to make his parents happy, even if it meant saying he did something awful.
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes you think about, how being interrogated like that can mess with your mind, especially when you're young.
For sure. But, the prosecution, they came back swinging. They argued that even though there were inconsistencies, his confession was still, like, legit, and that the other evidence backed it up. They made a big deal about how he led the police to the place where he supposedly got rid of the gun.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And, well, tragically, the jury found Nicholas guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, no chance of parole. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to those questions about his parents' role in all of this. Like, did their actions, even though they were trying to help, end up hurting him in the end?
Yeah, it's one of those, gray areas. You see how much they love him, how desperate they were to protect him, but then their involvement might have backfired.
It just shows how crucial it is to have a lawyer, especially if you're young and facing serious charges. Like, you need someone to make sure your rights are protected.
Yeah.
Someone to make sure your voice is actually heard. Okay, so we've really gone deep into all the details in Nicholas Lindsay's case, right? From the very beginning in that interrogation room all the way to the trial and the verdict. Now I think it's time to zoom out a little bit, look at the big picture. What can we actually learn from this case? What does it tell us about, the justice system, how much weight we put on confessions, and the impact of choices made under pressure?
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the things that really stands out to me is how much focus there was on Nicholas's confession, even though it had all these holes in it.
Right.
I mean, think about it. Even with all the inconsistencies and questions about whether it was even real, it basically became like the main thing the prosecution used to build their case.
It's so true. And it makes you wonder, right?
Yeah.
Why do confessions have so much power, even when there are reasons to doubt them?
Yeah, I think it's partly because, like, as humans, we tend to want to believe someone who admits they did something wrong, even if we have a feeling something isn't quite right.
Right. It's like we're wired to trust authority, especially in a courtroom. Like the police and the prosecutors. So when they say they have a confession, we almost automatically assume it's the truth.
Right, exactly. We don't even realize we're doing it. And then you add in the emotional impact a confession can have on a jury.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine hearing someone admit to something as serious as murder?
Yep.
That must be incredibly powerful. It probably overrides any other evidence, even if it doesn't totally add up.
Absolutely. It's like everyone wants a clear ending, a bad guy to blame. So a confession, it kind of gives that closure, even if it means not really looking at all the evidence fairly. And in Nicholas's case, we saw how his parents, wanting to protect him, might have actually pushed him into that confession. It's such a tricky situation. Like, where do we draw the line between supporting your child and, influencing them too much?
Yeah, exactly. Especially in a situation that's so legally complicated. It brings up all these ethical questions about how much pressure parents should be allowed to put on their kids in these types of situations.
Right. It's a question we could probably debate forever. Like, how do we balance a parent's natural instinct to protect their kid with the need to make sure the legal process is fair? It's a bigger conversation that goes way beyond just this one case. It makes us think about like parental rights, how vulnerable young people are in the legal system, and making sure everyone has a good lawyer to represent them.
Totally. And it reminds us that even though the justice system is supposed to be fair, mistakes can happen. People have biases. So we need to make sure there are protections in place for everyone, especially for young people who might be more easily pressured or manipulated, especially during interrogations.
It's really true. I think this case also makes us think about how we handle crime in general, especially here in the US. Like, Nicholas was only 15 when all this happened, and he got life in prison without parole. Is that really justice? Or is it more about punishment than actually trying to help young people who make mistakes?
It's definitely something we need to keep talking about as a society. Like, what are the long-term effects of being so tough on crime, especially for young people? Are we really helping anyone, or are we just locking them away without giving them a chance to change?
It's a big question. At the end of the day, we might never really know exactly what happened that night. Did Nicholas mean to kill Officer Crawford, or was it, a horrible accident that happened because he panicked and made a terrible decision? All those inconsistencies in his confession, the parts that don't really add up, it leaves us with a lot of questions.
It's true. But even though there are things we'll never know for sure, we can still learn from this case. It shows us just how complex the justice system is, how powerful confessions can be, and all the ethical challenges that come up when parents get involved in legal stuff.
Yeah, it makes us all think about how our actions, especially when we're under a lot of stress, can have huge consequences. Nicholas's choices that night, whether he meant to do it or not, they changed everything. Not just for him, but for the officer's family and the whole community. It's a heavy thing to think about.
This case is really like a warning. It makes us think about the choices we make, how important it is to have a good lawyer, and the need for a system that balances holding people accountable with compassion and giving people a chance to turn their lives around.
It's a conversation we need to keep having, for sure. It makes us question our own ideas about justice, about taking responsibility, and how we want our legal system to work.
Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some things to think about to keep digging into these really important issues. Remember, in a world where we're bombarded with information all the time, it's more important than ever to think critically, to question what we hear, and to really try to understand different points of view.